All right. Good morning, everybody. So it is about 10:30. So I think we're ready to get started today. Since there is a slightly different crew online this morning, why don't we start with introductions again? So we'll go around the room here and I'll go ahead and start and then we'll go online. So if for some reason I haven't met you, I'm Hillary Foote and I am the Farm and Forest Land Use Specialist for DLCD. And Angela is also here this morning.
Good morning, welcome everyone. Angela Williamson, the admin for this group.
And today we are privileged to be joined by Director Bateman.
Good morning, everyone. Brenda Bateman, Director of DLC. I'll say a few words in a few minutes.
And Blair.
Hi, I'm Blair Batson, Staff Attorney at 1000 Friends of Oregon.
Jim.
Hello, everyone. Jim Johnson, Land Use Water Planning Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Agriculture.
Mike.
Mike McCarthy Family Farm, Parkdale, Oregon.
All right, that's everybody here in Salem with us this morning. So why don't we go online? And Gordon, did you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Gordon Howard. I'm the Community Services Division Manager with DLCD. Just listening in to this discussion today.
And John, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, happily. John DeKarzik, Oregon Department of Forestry, Policy and Analysis.
And online, we also have our LCDC Commissioner, Barbara.
Good morning, Barbara Boyer, LCDC member, and I am here to listen. Thank you.
And Jackie.
Good morning, everyone. Jackie Dyke Jones, a farmer in Western Washington County.
And Christian.
Hi, Christian Richmond. I grow filberts in Yamhill and Clackamas County.
And Ian.
Good morning, Ian Sisson, Senior Planner with Clatsop County.
And Gail.
Hi, Gail Henriksen, Clatsop County Community Development Director.
And Nellie.
Hi, everyone. Nellie McAdams, Executive Director of Oregon Agricultural Trust.
And Maitri.
Hi, everybody. I'm Maitri. I'm the Senior Rural Planner with Washington County.
And Jennifer.
Morning, I'm Jennifer Hughes, Clackamas County Planning Director.
And the last, but certainly not least, Joy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joy Vaughn with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm the Land Use and Waterway Alterations Coordinator in Habitat Division.
So I think that is everybody. So first, a heartfelt thank you for joining us this morning and devoting your time to this effort. And before we get started today, Director Bateman, I think, is going to share a few thoughts with us.
Thank you, Hillary. I don't have anything planned per se, but I'm so excited that this initiative is underway. I've been encouraging Hillary to think of this more as a program and an ongoing initiative rather than a short-term project, because I understand there's a lot of work to do. It will take quite some time, and by the time you get to the end of it, it may be time to start over again. So I don't want anyone to get exhausted, fatigued, or panicked that we have to get something done. It's super quick. I think these are ideas that we'll continue talking about. I will tell you that this is one of the last things that Jim Roos said to me. You need to be paying attention to this. This issue area needs a lot of work, needs a lot of love. And so I just wanted to come and say hello. I'm sorry I missed your first meeting as I was out of town. I heard it was great, that the discussion was great. And as I look at the roster of old friends and new friends, I can't think of a more talented group of folks who knows these issues, who are smart and passionate and wanting to make sure that we've moved this program forward the way it needs to. I'm so glad that all of you are investing your time and energy in this. So I just wanted to welcome you just from my perspective tell you that I plan to sit in a little bit here today, and whenever I can, I'd love to listen to your conversation and listen to the kinds of things that you're grappling with and that you're seeing out there in your jobs and from your perspective. And thank you for your work. So carry on.
Thank you for that introduction. So I'm excited for today. I want to also thank everybody for the effort that you put into reviewing the initial draft issues matrix over the past couple of weeks. There were definitely, some items identified as additions that I was like, oh yeah, those should definitely be on the list. In all, folks identified about 25 additional issues for consideration, bringing our overall total to 45 issues, which is quite a lot. And I think that sort of underscores the need for this process and, why we're here. So 45 issues is a lot. What I've attempted to do is to relate issues that you identified to 4 major topics that sort of have been emerging through this conversation. And then each of those major topics is going to be the focus of one of our meetings. So today we are going to be talking about a certain set of non-farm uses and what I'll call multi-path permitting, and we'll get to that in a minute. At our next meeting, we are intending to talk about dwelling tests, and issues related to dwelling reviews. Then we also have a set of comments related to data and data analysis, and then a set of issues that are related to soils, the definition of agricultural lands, the definition of forest lands, and the definition of high value farmlands. And of course, there are a set of issues that don't fit neatly into one of those buckets. And so there are these other issues that also sort of merit consideration and discussion. So I think Angela has been working to schedule actually a second October meeting, so that our last meeting in November would be devoted to those sort of additional issues that don't have a nice home, and you wrap up or overflow conversation, because we do have a long list of things to consider. On that, I would also just say, if you are not able to attend, any of these meetings, I still would really like your feedback. Or if you did not have time, for example, to forward your thoughts on the issues matrix after our last meeting, I'd still love to hear from you. So the meetings are recorded, they're posted on the website. Feel free to catch any meetings that you miss. And forward your comments to me at any time. I always want to hear from you. All right. So before we get into the topic for today, just a reminder that the overall goal for this process is to come up with a sort of a work plan. We aren't going to necessarily solve all the details of everything through this, this fall working group. Additional detail can be ironed out in rules advisory committees, et cetera, the work that we end up moving forward with. So just a reminder, we don't need to solve everything in these conversations, but what we want to come up with is a list of issues that merit consideration, and sort of a list of items or actions that could be undertaken to address those issues. All right. So a reminder on the goal. So again, thank you for all your thoughts and feedbacks. It's really clear that you put a lot of time and effort into those responses. One of the themes that came up that'll run throughout all of these meetings is this idea of long-term adherence to standards or conditions for uses. right, or enforcement. And so one of the things that I'd ask people to keep, in the back of your heads as we're having this conversation are ways that enforcement or, long-term adherence can be built in to rules. So I'll just throw an example at guest ranches. The statutory authorization for guest ranches in Eastern Oregon requires, as one of those statutory standards, that an operator of a guest ranch submit an annual report to the county that contains a certain set of information about the activities and operations of the ranch. So I'll throw that out there as an example of I'll use the word enforcement tool that's sort of built in to the regulatory framework that's not perfect, but it's something that can help, make sure that as time goes on, something continues to meet the standards that were set out and under which it was originally approved. So think about that in the back of your heads as we're having these conversations. The other theme that really emerged in the responses is what we're going to talk about today. And that is non-farm uses and multi-path permitting. And the lack of clarity sometimes between those different pathways and the sort of challenge of, figuring out, what use goes in what bucket. And Jim and I actually did a presentation to the Board of Ag a couple of weeks ago where we talked about this. And so I'm going to use an example to explain multi-path permitting that I used for the Board of Ag. So I'll use cider tasting as an example. All right, so if I am, developing a business proposal that involves cider tasting, there are a bunch of different options I might talk to my county planning department about. So first off, I could maybe consider the farm stand option. So farm stands are a sub 1 use, which we talked about last week, that counties are required to make available. Counties cannot be more restrictive than the standards that are in statute and rule. And at a farm stand, in addition to selling farm products, I can also offer fee-based events and sales of retail incidental items, as long as the revenue from those fee-based events and incidental retail items don't exceed 25% of the revenue from the farm stand. All right. So I might, offer cider tastings to support the sale of hard cider at my farm stand. So that might be one option. Or I might look at an agritourism event permit for a large agritourism event, a single use one, 6 events a year, 18 events a year, subject to the standards that are in 215, 283, 4 or 215, 213, I think it's 711. But if I want to have more cider tasting events than maybe would be permitted under an agritourism event permit, then, and maybe, I'm also processing cider and I might look at getting a permit for a cidery business under 215 450. So if I have, a certain number of acres planted and orchard, or, a certain contract for apple supply, if I'm producing under a certain volume of cider, I could look at getting a cidery business approval. If I'm producing more cider than that, or and I can have, all the cider tasting events, at that cidery business. So say I'm producing more cider than is allowed as a cidery business, maybe I would consider getting a permit as a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use, where I'm buying apples from the local agricultural area. Or if I wanted to just offer cider tastings, maybe I would talk to the county about a home occupation permit approval to run cider tastings out of the shop on my property. So just in this one sort of business proposal, these are ways in which these sort of things get approved. And it's confusing. Which pathway am I going to direct my applicant toward? Like where's that line between when I should actually have them get an agritourism event permit versus, letting them have fee-based events at a farm stand. So this is an issue that almost everybody agreed they would like to see it addressed. And there are lots of different proposals on how to tackle this. So one, I think there was a universal agreement of folks who responded about the role that codifying case law can provide in clarifying what happens in each of those possible permitting channels. And almost everybody said, and we should do something more than that. Can we clarify additional terms like essential? Can we provide lists of examples, non-exclusive lists of uses that are appropriate for each of those pathways? Can we prohibit certain types or categories of uses from being considered as home occupations or commercial activities in conjunction with? There were a number of different ideas of that nature that were brought up. Can the agency provide a guidance document to clarify, when the particular pathway is applicable to a proposal? So lots of ideas. And today, I think we are going to talk about that second bucket more than codifying case law. If you have questions about the case law that was in the matrix that was circulated or codifying it, this is one of those areas where more work will be done in a rules advisory committee to finalize that language. But if you have questions about it or concerns about it, go ahead and bring that up today. But I think today we're going to focus more of the conversation on, what more could be done to help clarify the multi-path permitting situation. Okay, so with that introduction, I'm going to stop talking and listen to you folks. So I'm hoping to spend about the next 20 minutes talking about commercial activities in conjunction with farm use, and then moving on to spending about probably a half an hour talking about home occupations and short-term rentals. And so let's start there. So as you were looking at case law standards for commercial activities in conjunction with, reading, other people's ideas or suggestions, what came up for you all about commercial activities in conjunction with farm use? And to help facilitate the conversation, I'm going to share my screen with that section of the matrix. That sharing? Yeah.
Sure, I'll start it. Over the years, I've had a lot of discussions, questions, from county planners and the like about this topic. How does this relate? What is essential for agriculture and the like? And I think, we're not going to discuss a lot about this, and I support it. But I think the first thing is we do need to codify the case law. There's some good direction in that from the City of Sandy, Clackamas County case that goes years and years and years back. There's some really good language there. But beyond that, I think there's two areas, and Blair will probably add to this because she and I have had a lot of talk about this one specific use, whatever. But I think there needs to be some more discussion about what types of uses actually are associated or essential to agriculture, and start to try to put a circle around that, so to speak. Because right now you would not believe the things that I've heard that people are arguing are essential to agriculture. And that was kind of the basis of the Sandy case, also the Clackamas County case, you know, fax machines and U-Haul trucks and the like, those, you know, that type of thing. So I think some exploration in terms of maybe putting you know, trying to define better what types of uses are essential to agriculture is going to be important. I mean, it's obvious to me, for example, that fertilizer supply companies, that type of thing, are essential to agriculture. And in a lot of ways, they're locationally dependent in that they need to be near agriculture because it's a bulk capacity and you can only, you know, travel certain distances before they're not, you know, it's not an effective thing or whatever. On the other hand, a farm implement dealership that's selling mostly to rural areas, their John Deere tractor for mowing their lawn is not essential to agriculture, yet we're seeing those pop up all over the place. So, you know, trying to limit, you know, to talk about those uses. And that brings me to the next point. Even certain uses that are essential to agriculture, it's a scale issue. We recently had a proposal to do a processing facility on land zone for exclusive farming, and it was very obvious that they were servicing the ag community. They were, you know, that's where they were delivering their product to be processed, like, you know, a cannery, for example, or something like that. But how far do you go before the scale of that operation is problematic to agriculture? When does something become too big and in terms of needing sewer and water and other services that it should probably be located in an industrial zone instead of on agricultural land? So do we talk about scale here also? And I would point to something that the legislature did years ago, recognizing this issue. They made small scale processing a sub-1 use. Beyond that, you had to go into a different area and go through a conditional use process. I think we may even need to go one step further and say, even in that conditional use process, where does that scale stop to such that it becomes more of an urban use where you've got goal 14 issues, you've got goal 11 issues with services and the like, and that maybe shouldn't be allowed on exclusive farm use on land. So scale, you know, locational scale, like something that I've thought about over the years in terms of commercial use in conjunction with farming. So that's just something to get the ball rolling. But those have been some of the key things that have been in my experience over the years.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's just a goal 14, goal 11?
It's also, it's a compatibility issue also. I mean, for the one operation that I've been working on, soon as the proposal was made to be cited on exclusive farm use on land, this was high value farmland. That's another thing, maybe we go between high value and non-high value. Is the first thing I started getting calls from the farmers saying, yes, we need this type of facility, but it's not compatible to our operations out here. We're concerned about water supply. We're concerned about sewage management. We're concerned about traffic on the roads for our employees that will have implications on our ability to operate and move our machinery around. Where, you know, those were all things that the farmers had concerned about. And in this case, to the proponents' credit, they listened to the farmers and said, we don't belong out here. And they actually ended up locating inside the Portland metro urban growth boundary on land zone industrial. So kind of thing. So, but that doesn't always happen that way. We had a proposal for a hemp processing plant in Marion County that was like 100,000 square feet. My gosh, located out in the middle of a rural area. It was going to totally change the character of that area, totally have implications on the surrounding farming operations that you know, needed that ability to operate and the like. So where is that breaking point, you know, kind of thing? Do we put a limit on that somehow? Not unlike what the legislature did with the small scale processing.
Thank you. Jackie, you have your hand up?
Yeah, in listening to Jim, I get back to, well, right this second, I'm a little shocked that the example where they were looking in the EFU area and then found a place in the Portland metro that was zoned industrial. I am shocked that they would listen to the farmer or see the situation and do that, knowing full well that that was probably way more expensive. So unless there was a way to, there's such a disconnect with the value because it's cheaper for developing in the EFU. That's why it keeps attracting these inappropriate uses, in my opinion. So there's a financial component that I know is not the land use law, but I just felt like I had to say that because when we're talking about, okay, if I'm farming and I want to be vertically integrated, well, first of all, it's so expensive and such a risk. I can't really see myself doing that unless there was a huge, like, federal grant or opportunity. So most of the non-farm uses or extensions that are stretches to their current operations are just for the financial incentives, I guess, for the long-term benefits. That's why it's such a stretch, whether you're starting a fencing company or whatever. I guess I just wanted to bring up the financial component and why, and explain how it's so intriguing and why people are going after it.
Yeah, this is a really striking example that you brought up, Jim, of, somebody who actually was, a business that's serving agricultural area, and listen to their potential customers as far as their concerns are going. Christian, you had a comment?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to thank Jim and Jackie for their comments and just follow up and just talking to other colleagues and farmers about this. I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that, and I just wanted to specify this, that despite what we're seeing, there's nothing in the CACFU language that authorizes temporary overnight lodging, restaurants, drinking establishments, or events. In addition to codifying the case law, I just think it's important for us to underscore this and just generally prohibit CACFUs on high value farmland.
So that is an interesting idea. Should certain types of uses be precluded from being considered as a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use? So Jim talked about, working to identify the types of activities that are essential to the agricultural economy. Now, are there certain types of activities that are clearly not and should be sort of explicitly precluded from consideration as a commercial activity?
Yeah, you've got me two more.
Everybody's raising their hand.
So, yeah, first, on that last point, when I was in school, so that's been a long, long time ago, one of the basic tenets of zoning law that I was taught was that if something is permitted and actually described in one aspect of the zoning district, you can't call it something else someplace else. So let me give you an example. Wineries specifically have their own statute, and it says this is how wineries are approved, and the legislature said fine, but then in that statute they actually said wineries can also be approved as a commercial use in conjunction with farm use. So there's legislative intent there. That's not any place else. So if a farm stand is defined and listed in the statute, why and you can't meet that statutory requirements, why is it being authorized as a commercial use in conjunction with farm use? I think that one of the things that we need to consider is maybe it's going to need to be made clear that unless specifically authorized, if you're in the statute or rule, if you're listed as a use someplace else and you can't authorize it that way, it's not allowed anymore. And if you can't meet the farm stand standard, you can't go and get it approved as a commercial use in conjunction with farm use. If you can't get a park approved, parks are listed in the zone. If you can't get the park approved, you can't turn around and argue it's a commercial use in conjunction with farm use because you're going to have a farm living history museum on there that's, whatever. You wouldn't believe the angles I've seen over my career on this kind of thing. So that basic tenet of zoning law that goes way, way back, that if a use is specifically defined in one place, you can't call it something else someplace, we need to really take a hard look at. The second thing that I was reminded of is within the definition of farm use, there's the term preparation. And that there's a real confusing aspect to what is preparation versus what is processing. And I spend a lot of time talking to planners around the state, discussing what I think is preparation versus what is processing. And we could try to better define that. LCDC's rules do define that a little bit, but it is still, you know, there was a court case out of Lynn County, a Luba case 3 or 4 years back, the Gilmore case, where you know, I had even commented to the county that I believed that it was preparation. The county still denied and said no, it was processing, and it went to court, and the court said no, that is preparation. You know, there's discussion back and forth about that, and you know, and there's a real gray area in between. Is grass seed cleaning preparation or is it processing? You're not changing the character of the grass seed, you're just cleaning it. Arguably, I could make the argument both ways, but legally I would say it's preparation. I think we just need to, you know, better define the difference between preparation and processing also.
And on that point, as I recall in our rules, there's a circular reference
Yeah.
in that definition as well, that had been noted as an issue previously. But we can bring that up, back to the list as well.
But yeah, and then the reason I brought it up here is because of it's not very well defined. So sometimes somebody will go through and argue. We had a case in Klamath County where they were basically saying that something that we considered at ODA a farm use, the county was saying was a conditional use permit, and they ended up denying that, and we lost a business. It was a Japanese business that was, in our opinion, was a farm use because of poor definition. So.
I know Christian and Jackie had their hands up, but let's hear from Jennifer. I'd be curious to hear the planning perspective on this conversation.
Thanks. And yeah, I guess I am here to kind of speak for the practitioners of all of this. And just kind of as a backdrop to probably everything I'll say in every meeting we have, I suspect other counties are in the same situation we are, which is that staff has turned over at a very rapid rate. And, you know, for us, we're a pretty large county for planning. We have 11 planners on staff, which is actually down from where we should be. And, you know, half of them have been hired in the last 2 years. We only have one person here now who's been here longer than 10. I mean, I think it takes 5 years to even understand what we're doing, quite frankly. So there is a need against, you know, I hope it's considered during all of this that this stuff needs to get less complicated. And I'm not convinced that, I do think codifying case law is better than what we have now, but I'm not convinced that that really reduces the complexity. And I think, you know, Hillary, your example's fantastic. I've had that of the cidery. I've had that conversation with employees and customers. And the problem is you just keep having to have it over and over and over again with new employees. And they don't, it's too complicated. They don't understand. It's like there's 6 different ways that you could potentially do this. And I guess I would say is there shouldn't be 6 different ways. And maybe that's kind of what Jim is saying, that a use should be a use should be a use. And you shouldn't have all these different options to maybe do what's essentially the same thing. So less complicated. And I know there's always this push and pull between flexibility and clarity. We fight that in our regulations all the time. You don't want to make it so black and white that people can't do things that are reasonable. But at some point, it's so discretionary, so flexible that nobody knows what it means. And I'm a believer that that builds dissatisfaction in the public with our system. I just don't think you influence people and convince them it's a good program when you make it too hard to understand. So that's kind of my my soapbox for the day. And then I wanted to speak kind of specifically to what Jim was saying about preparation versus processing. I completely agree. We struggle with that. I have a hard time really explaining it. And I think the other piece is, when does processing become manufacturing? Like, is there a difference? It's sort of that scale thing. If I'm processing, let's say, berries, can I bring in all kinds of other ingredients from all over the world to turn it into something that's really far from being a berry, but has a berry in it? And I think we have struggled with that with specific, you know, uses that people want to do. And so I'd like to see us look at drawing some lines there about what the upper limit is on what constitutes agricultural processing.
Right. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, I think that is a very important point from a practitioner standpoint. It is difficult to explain all these avenues multiple times to prospective applicants, and the clarity, I think, will make folks' lives a lot easier. Jackie and then Maitri.
Thank you. in thinking about like cideries, for example, or wine in the EFU on the farm. So when these other operations are taking place on the farm, I'm starting to wrap my head around, well, why couldn't the actual tasting be somewhere else, like in the UGB? I'm just chewing on that for a second. But also I'm getting a little like worked up on the language and about the preparation and processing, because agriculture cannot be put in a box. I'm going back to the fact that there is a different price value. So I'm a farmer, I get paid blank for my grass seed. Then it goes to the seed cleaner, then they get paid blank for that. Each step adds value. And when we cannot be put in a box, we need a level playing field, and we need to be able to move our commodities in a efficient and productive way for Oregon agriculture as a whole. So I just wanted to throw it out there that this has to do with money, and everyone's trying to make money. So they're going to ask and try to get to do whatever they can so that they can make the most money. So that's it for now.
Yeah, your comment, I feel like, speaks to the importance of making sure that there is adequate space in rural environments so that sort of the regionally dependent food system infrastructure. And that food system infrastructure is, accounted for when we look at rural economies. And, where does it go? Is there enough rural commercial industrial land out there to accommodate that? When does it have to be located in land that's been protected for agriculture? What is the appropriate, right? Maitri?
Well, I just wanted to comment on the option of the multi-paths available, like you presented the cidery example. And I think it's a good option to have multiple paths available to people, because not everybody wants to do it in the same scale. We often see, like, even for wine tasting, some people just want it as a home occupation because they wanted to keep it small in scale. Some present it as a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use because they don't really have a huge vineyard, but they do produce enough to open a tasting room on their own property, whereas others come in for a proper winery because they just kind of meet all the criteria. So just a little more clarity would be helpful, but I do support having all of the multiple options available to people for these uses.
Mm-hmm. So that sort of begs the question is, about scale and intensity a little bit that we were talking about earlier. Like, at what point is the scale no longer appropriate for a farm zone? Should there be multiple options, for small scale and larger scale businesses?
I don't disagree with the concept that Maitri's talking about, but I do disagree with having all these different types of land use to do. So I would rather see for example, what the legislature did with processing is define small scale versus something else, or what wineries have. They got the different tiers there, the different levels and the like. And if we really want to provide different options, for example, for a cidery or for a on-farm brewery, or don't get me going on that, but then let's put it in the language for that cidery or for that brewery, as opposed to, oh, no, you can't get approved as a cidery, so we're going to go over here and do a home occupation. Instead, let's have small scale, whatever, as opposed to switching gears and going into each of these different categories, which have different case law, which have different legislative intent. In fact, if you go and look at the legislative intent about commercial uses in conjunction with farm use or home occupations is another great example. It wasn't, the legislative intent was not to do all these things that are happening. So, so if we really need those options or alternatives, I'm not, I'd want to see the details to go when I go on. They should be encapsulated within the specific use, as opposed to being named something different and going these different angles. Let's stop playing that game and just really focus on the use itself and what makes it appropriate in an exclusive farm use zone next to, diversified agriculture.
Mm-hmm. And are there, I'm sorry, Mike, did you want to respond?
So yeah, I kind of like Jim's approach on that too. If there's different tiers available under the same use category, that's also a good option. And while we're on that topic, I also wanted to point out to you that we also have inquiries from people, where we allow this 25% incidental income. People often come and ask about having 2 or 3 different types of commercial uses on the property and whether 25% from each of them could contribute to the events. So just wanted to throw it out there.
So for folks who missed it, Maitre's from Washington County. That's a little bit of a.
She's always got really intriguing questions for me. She makes me think.
Thank you for being patient with me all the time.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that sometime.
Which brings up a really interesting point where you see stacked uses on a property. That we see quite a lot in some of the Valley counties, Yamhill, Washington, Marion, where you might have all of those permits.
Well, and Maitre's County is an example of the question of consistency also, because I'll get calls from farmers in Washington County saying, why can they do this in Yamhill County, but we can't do it in Washington County? Or I'll get farmers in Yamhill County saying they can do this in Washington County, we can't do it in Yamhill County. So that is a very honest response from the agriculture community, and that is that having equal playing field, because they compete against each other. So they want to have the same playing field. Anyways, that's Washington Yamhill is the one I get those calls on the most.
So I'll just add a quick additional bit of information there. So for sub-2 uses like commercial activities in conjunction with farm use, different counties, this is one of the uses where different counties do have some different standards around here. For example, Marion does have some of the case law codified in their code based on what we recommended in our model code, just as an example. So different counties do, approach commercial activities in conjunction with farm use in different ways. And this is, one of the areas where the land use planning program has flexibility built into it for some local jurisdictions to be more restrictive than state law. And it's also a critique that we hear, particularly in conversation with agritourism.
So to build on that, though, I think the real issue there is the added restrictions for a sub-2 use generally, not always, but generally relate to compatibility issues. For example, applying compatibility issues for other uses, not just agriculture, but rural residential and the like, versus what is the use. That's where I get, Washington County allows this as a commercial use in conjunction with farm use. Yamhill County does the definition thing, as opposed to adding additional standards to review that. In other words, getting into that step before you get into the review is one thing, the definition of what is versus then what are the review standards. And I think the review standards, every county is going to have different situations where they, Clackamas County has a lot of rural residential use out in and amongst its farmland. So they also have compatibility issues, carrying capacity issues with that rural residential. Whereas Marion County, the integrity of their farmland is much different. There's not a lot of rural residential out there, so they may not have the same issue. So I understand that it's what can or cannot be reviewed as a home occupation from one county to another, or what can or can't be reviewed as a commercial use in conjunction from one county or another. That's where I get the calls. It doesn't mean it's still going to be approved or not, because they may have different review standards. It's just what can be plugged into those different categories.
So then I'm hearing that, having some guidance or spending some time looking at, what types of uses are essential to agriculture and what aren't would be helpful in standardizing what can be permitted as commercial activities or as home occupations from county to county. Christian's been very patient.
So is this guy over here.
And Mike is also being very patient. Christian, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I hope I'm not jumping the line. I just wanted to follow up on Jennifer's comments from much earlier about codifying case law, not necessarily increasing clarity, but I think it's good to remind ourselves that zooming out a little bit, the impact of this issue is huge and the complexity of the resolution is low. We have an opportunity here to clarify a rather clear legislative intent. And I know it might sound extreme to say that we should just prohibit CACFUs on high value farmland. And I'm not trying to discount arguments in favor of vertical integration, but I think we can honor the legislative intent and still make room for farmers' needs.
Thank you. And I think at our third meeting, when we talk about high value farmland, we'll also talk about limiting uses on high value farmland as an option as well, a little bit farther. Mike, you've also been very inclusive.
Yeah, I've been involved in land use planning in Oregon now for 43 years, and I've worked with a lot of planners and I've done a lot of cases. I've appealed a lot of cases, and what I've seen is the biggest problem is the lack of clarity in the law and the lack of simplicity. I agree with what Jennifer said. We really do need to make it easier. Practitioners try to do their best to figure out where it goes or what it is, and they have sometimes 5 lawyers talking to them who are trying to make it not fit or fit when it doesn't fit. And so I think we need to really clarify and simplify. And I think we need to, on these multiple ones, we need to have them apply only under one area that's their principal use. We have an example in Hood River County where we have one that's a winery, cidery, brewery, pizza restaurant, wedding venue, farm stand, and agritourism venue. And it was applied for under commercial activities. And it's really pretty much out of control, and yet it may meet sort of the letter of the law, unfortunately. But there's a huge issue when you apply for too many. It has a huge negative impact on the farm zone, the farming around there. And that needs to be taken into consideration. So I think if it's a cidery, it needs to be the principal use. If it's a winery, if it's several, it still needs to be the one that is the principal one and not any other pathways. It gets too complicated. People don't understand it. And some of them get too big. There's got to be some limitation on the size and the impacts to the surrounding community. It's almost impossible to prove that it has one if you're a farmer next door. It takes all your time and effort and money to try to prove that it's a negative impact. And so, I think many of us that farm, particularly in a county like Hood River County, there's way too many commercial uses on farm ground. It's really reducing the amount of land available to farm. It's reducing the amount of product produced in the area. And it's actually resulting mostly in a tourism economy and not a farm economy. So, there's huge negative consequences. And I think we can make it much clearer and much simpler by having only certain pathways, limited pathways to apply for different uses. I don't think commercial activity should be used to apply for anything that has anything to do with a winery, cidery, brewery, agritourism, or a farm stand. It should not be used at all for those activities.
So what I'm hearing generally as feedback, a couple of different things that are emerging. One, codified case law. That'll be a step in the right direction. Sort of 2, can we clarify or do some work on what types of uses are essential to agriculture and what types of uses aren't? 3, in looking at all of these different pathways, can we limit certain uses to certain channels while still balancing, flexibility for different tiers of intensity and scale? And lastly, should there be sort of a cap on scale and intensity for consideration. The commercial activity in conjunction with farm use for consideration as a home occupation. How could we clarify, what that is? And is working on those definitions on preparation and processing versus, industrial manufacturing use. Will that go, a ways towards helping define that scale and intensity that's permissible?
So the planners are gonna hate me for this, but remember, I'm one of you too. You just remind, I have been really concerned over the years about the cumulative impact of non-farm uses on farmland. And the more I think about it, the more I want to see a cumulative impacts analysis required for all sub 2 uses, to be quite honest. There is case law on cumulative impact. It's because cumulative impact analysis is required for non-farm dwellings under current law. Something that I'd just like us to think about on, whatever, but is, do we apply the overall stability of the land use pattern or the cumulative impacts analysis to non-farm uses? Especially, Mike was talking about Hood River County. When you look at what's going on in Hood River County right now with agritourism and the like, how much is too much? Napa County in California has cut it off. No more wineries are allowed in Napa County because they've hit a critical mass, and it's just implicated not only farm use, but the wineries. Not even some of the wineries that were approved can now operate efficiently because there's way too many wineries and there's too much traffic and so do we do a cumulative impacts analysis? I'm just throwing that out there.
So are you thinking of something beyond the sort of farm by farm, practice by practice, individual cumulative impacts to?
Well, the farm by farm type thing is really more of a farm impacts test as it relates to farming practices. I'm thinking about what is the cumulative impact of the multiple agritourism and the like or whatever, not only to agriculture, but to the rural land use pattern. What's it doing to traffic on the roads? What is it doing to the ability of farmers to operate? I mean, 5 or 6 wineries in Hood River County may be fine, but 20 or 30, considering how compact the agricultural land base is there, could be the breaking point. Whereas that many in Yamhill County may be fine. So, it's got to be that, based on the site situation. I mean, Hood River County is ground zero in some ways because it is so compact. It also is very intensive. It's a different kind of agriculture. I mean, you go over and do this in say Morrow County. It's just a different type of agricultural practices. So it's hard to necessarily in some cases develop objective standards because you've got to take into account the site, the situation, the character of agriculture, the character of the landscape and the like. And sorry, planners, but that's a spatial analysis that sometimes we have to do.
I would like to follow up on that because that's also a big problem in Yamhill County and the wine country. It's in these pretty places growing high value crops, and where the tourist industry is attracted to, and farmers taking advantage of that, right? So I think that Jim's suggestion is great. Dick Benner actually told me that in the gorge they do it because what you're getting at that's a little different than the stuff the dump is. You do an analysis and you go, how many of these have been approved? How many non-farm uses? And then you go, if we keep approving them, are we going to tip the better? Meaning, are we going to lose agriculture as the primary business here and tip to commercial? And you don't want to do that. And I think that's really, as Jim said, that's maybe not a concern in Morrow County, but it really is a concern in Yamhill County and part in the wine country of Yamhill County. It really is a concern. And I think it is a pain. I mean, no doubt it's a pain for everybody. It's a pain for the applicant, for the planners, and for the opponents. But I think it's good policy. And I don't think there's a magic way to get around it.
So
just on this, I can't believe I forgot what Blair just said. I worked for the Gorge Commission when we wrote that standard. I think it's worth taking a look at what the Gorge Commission does in the National Scenic Area for cumulative impact analyses for that kind of thing. I can't believe I forgot that. I probably wrote it, in fact, but it's worth taking a look at it and maybe even talking to some of the commission staff in terms of how that's played out. I'm not saying it's the right standard, but it's a place to look at. I mean, we don't have to rewrite the book and everything. If something's working someplace, let's take a look at it.
So this is a topic we're gonna talk about more at our next meeting. We're gonna talk about non-park dwellings. And, I think this is also something that we're gonna talk about when we talk about sort of data requirements and sort of landscape level analyses. That's gonna be part of either our next meeting or I think a virtual meeting that Angela is looking at. So I do recognize that that's,
I'm gonna do some phone calls too. I'm not only to the Gorge Commission, but I think I'm gonna call Napa County and talk to them. It's been a while since I've talked to them, so.
So we want to make sure that we get plenty of time to talk about home occupations and short-term rentals, which did come up as a concern. And I hope, I included TILCA, I think, in the case law matrix that was sent out. That kind of votes. Okay.
You know what's really important with home occupations is to look at some of that case law, not only because of what the court said is how the law should be applied, but several of those court cases related to home occupations discuss the legislative intent. And you need to get back to what the legislative intent was there. And home occupations have been blown way out past what the legislative intent was. It's supposed to be little personal business that you hardly know they're there. You're in the residence, somebody's a CPA or somebody's got their home office as a lawyer, or it's not supposed to be these large lodging facilities, that type of stuff. So I think it's really, really important that we go and look at that legislative intent again in terms of what a home occupation is, and then do something in the rules or whatever to better employ or define what that legislative intent is for home occupations. I mean, that's exactly what they're supposed to be, a home with an occupation in it, not an occupation with a home that happens to be associated.
I like that distinction. So some counties have additional standards for home occupations that limit them beyond what is beyond the standards that are in statute and rural. So planners out there, home occupations, do you further limit them? I think, as I recall, Washington County actually takes a more restrictive approach to them than I think I've seen in other jurisdictions. Jennifer?
So yes and no is the answer for Clackamas County. We have for 40 years had I guess what I'll call our baseline home occupation ordinance that it's been tweaked here and there, but has been very similar since the early 80s, and it applies everywhere. It's not unique to resource zones. We apply it in our urban residential zones. There is a two-tiered approach where home occupations in areas where lots are larger can be a little more intense than the ones in, a basic urban subdivision. But over the years, the board has expanded what is considered a home occupation. And so we have two pathways that allow things that are a lot more intense. One is what we call an exception. We treat it similar to a conditional use. It does require a public hearing, and it does have an impacts analysis. It's not a farm and forest impact analysis. It's an analysis related to, impacts on the neighborhood, I guess. And then in addition to that, we have home occupations to host events, which I'm sure is one of the poster children for this discussion. And we are seeing high interest in establishing these event venues in conjunction with, somebody's dwelling on resource lands and rural residential lands. So yeah, and that's really, we have some standards that are local for that. And of course we apply the limits in state law, but the home occupation limits in state law are really, very minimal in my view.
Right. And if I recall, there were some pretty large scale event venue proposals in your jurisdiction and associated with a home occupation. So again, talking about, the idea of limiting scope, scale, intensity related with some of the abuses and getting back to the original intent. And Maitri, would you just share with us a little bit about how Washington County approaches them? Because I think it's interesting.
We're pretty restrictive too for home occupations. We allow only one outside employee and no outdoor use areas are allowed. If you're using an accessory structure or a dwelling, either 1,000 square feet or no more than 25% of the whatever structure you're using, and up to 9 customers, but then that's like, it is subject to an impact analysis. So we do kind of restrict it, and yeah, absolutely no outdoor use areas allowed. So
So there's some examples, and you don't, remind me, you don't allow bed and breakfast, right?
bed and breakfasts are, no, we don't, right? We allow that only in, for the resource lands, we allow that only in conjunction with a winery or a cidery or brewery, yeah. Not as a home occupation. The resource lands.
So there is an example and some ideas on sort of spatial limitations that could be applied to home occupations to get back to the original sort of intent of the statute. There's also been some suggestions around the type of buildings that could be associated with home occupations. Originally, the language referred to dwellings that were, help me out, customarily associated with farm practice, or I'm sorry, structures customarily associated with farm practices. I think there's a leg in 215-203 that talks about that. That was the reference originally before it was moved to a different section of statute. And then there's the idea of prohibiting certain types of uses from taking place as a home occupation, like Washington, does not allow short-term rentals or bed and breakfasts as home occupations. Short-term rentals has been an item of conversation. There seemed to be a lot of interest in prohibiting that as a home occupation among this group in the feedback that I got from folks. Kristen and then Mike. Again.
Thank you. My comments on occupations will sound somewhat similar to my comments on CACFUS, but I just wanted to clarify that in addition to restoring legislative intent as explained in the issues matrix, the draft issues matrix, I just wanted to clarify that there is nothing in this provision that allows for overnight lodging, as Jim alluded to, restaurants, drinking establishments, or events. And one other maybe more nuanced clarification, that the home occupation must live in the existing dwelling where the home occupation is sought. It can't be a hired manager or other employee.
All right, so the way it's worded now would allow a resident also to operate a home occupation, if I'm not mistaken. And so there was also a suggestion of removing that reference and limiting it to the owner as well.
So, yeah, my comment relative to that was under home occupations, you can use the home or buildings that were already existing on the property. Is that correct?
Unclear. Buildings associated with the primary use.
Okay, and the reason I bring that up is what we're seeing. There needs to be a date on those buildings, because what we're seeing is somebody will build an ag building that's 12,000 square feet and then use that for their home occupation. They'll apply for the home occupation after that time. And that seems like not really the intent.
For folks who don't know, when we're talking about an agricultural building, these is a building category that's exempt from structural review under the state building code. And there is actually a provision in statute that in chapter 215 that says that buildings permitted as agricultural buildings, you can't change the use of them because they didn't go through structural review. So just to clarify that, so it sounds that this is actually something that's happening in practice where things are getting approved as agricultural buildings and then actually used for.
Yeah, it would be interesting to talk to the folks over at the building codes division also, because what happens is even getting away from the zoning or land use requirements here now. So you build a 10,000 square foot facility for storing hay in, and you see these huge things that are just gigantic, whatever. Pull the hay out of there and you start having events in there. Under under the exemptions, under building code exemptions for ag buildings, that only, regardless of the use, if there's more than 10 people in that building, or the public has access to that building, even if it's a farm building, you now are subject to the building code. And that gets to things like sprinkler systems, handicap access, on and on and on. And it would be interesting to see how many of these quote unquote ag buildings that are now being used as home occupations or the like, whatever, have gotten a new occupancy permit for allowing the public to come in. I mean, another call that I get a lot from is horsey type people that have an arena or a stable or whatever, and they want to have, they go in and the county says, you got to get a building permit for this. And the horse person is arguing, well, I'm exempt from the building code. And they call me up and the first thing I ask them is, do you allow the public to come into your building? They say, yes. And I go, you're not exempt anymore. The county is correct. And so, but on the other hand, are there a lot of them out there that new building code is not being applied once the public's allowed into that building? So
Jennifer?
So I could go on for hours about ag exempt structures, and I won't because we don't have the time, but let me just, I guess, say that I do think this is something we need to look at. That provision that was added in 2013, I've got all the background because our attorney just looked into it for somebody, and a lot of you probably already know it as well. But it's created a couple of strange outcomes. One being that the rules in EFU are different than the rules for conversions than they are in forest and mixed farm and forest zones. And it creates a little bit of absurdity, kind of an unsustainable approach to building usage. If somebody can get land use approval and building code approval to convert an ag building to something else, I feel like they should be able to do it. And instead, we're in a position of saying, no, you get to tear that building down. You can build the same thing from scratch with a permit and use it for a permitted use. So we're feeling like it's kind of silly the way it's currently written. That said, yes, I think there are obviously enforcement issues with these structurally exempt buildings being converted to other things. We require, I mean, as a condition, I think very consistently, we coordinate with our building department and require people to get building permits if they're going to convert to event venues and all that. Of course, it doesn't stop some people from starting operation without proper permits, but that issue of needing to do the conversion is certainly on our radar. It's just weird now because for the last 10 years or so, you haven't been able to do that in a couple of zones, and it has not at all been well understood. So I'm sure we have been improving conversions that we really weren't supposed to, just not realizing.
Good points.
Maytree?
Yes, I just kind of wanted to lend support to what they said, that people first, in order to have a home occupation in an accessory structure, then they go ahead, they build a structure based on their needs, and then they say, we're just using 25% of that structure, and it's a fairly large area. That's one. And then, for ag buildings, people are converting it to home occupations. We do condition them to go through the building code standards and make sure it's all up to speed. And that sometimes deters people because it turns out to be a pretty expensive project for them. So they just don't follow up on that.
And for Jennifer and Maytree and Gail and Ian, are there ideas? You have ideas that would help with this issue with agricultural buildings and conversion and enforcement from your perspective?
Well, somebody suggested maybe having a date of sorts about how far back the building should have existed.
All right. So any other comments on home occupations? I think so far we've heard exclude certain types of activities from consideration. Look at certain dimensional standards that will help limit the scope and intensity of home occupation. Require home occupations to be located in certain types of buildings. Require home occupations to be located in buildings that existed as a date certain, having a look back date.
I love Washington County standards.
The existence of those buildings and prohibiting certain types of uses like short-term rentals to be located within home occupations or restaurants. events, drinking establishments. Question.
And the other suggestion was, and I know this, that with the general home occupation statute, that it's the homeowner,
And the homeowner.
yeah, it's let it share.
So short-term rentals would have their own code spot somewhere and not be within home occupations, or where would?
So that is a question. Short-term rentals are not a use. It's listed in chapter 215. Right? And so it is unclear whether I think that there could be a use that's permitted in a farm zone or not. The recent decision from the Court of Appeals indicates that, and the LUBA decision that went along with it, that if it were allowed, it would have to be subject to 215-296 review. And it's, I don't know if it was totally definitive that it's.
Basically, it's lodging, it's
But-
not residential use is what it's saying.
Right.
And so if it's lodging, you've got to go through the appropriate review process to approve lodging
It's a commercial.
as a commercial,
commercial
as
use.
opposed to just calling it a, yeah.
Yeah, it's not a.
Jennifer knows that quite well. That was in her county. So
So we spent a lot of time with that in River County, and at one time we had 140 unpermitted short-term rentals in the farm zone.
Mhm.
But the problem is how do you enforce it? Because we did various things to find out who was out there doing it, but then they go underground and then you can't really find them. And we have many of them operating in my area that do not advertise anymore because they have a list of clients
Mhm.
and they continue to function. And I don't know how counties are gonna work on that.
So, different counties have sort of different, transient lodging, programs. Some of them hire services to sweep listings and, engage in sort of enforcement activities. I don't know if that's
I was gonna say, what's the coast?
Clackamas or Washington do, have that kind of a service. But that's outside of the realm of land use. That's usually related to capturing transient lodging tax and making sure everything gets recorded and permitted and subject to whatever type of lodging program.
But it is land use in that it's a land use that hasn't been authorized. And I mean, it's easy for me to say now that I'm not a county planner, but I had a tickler file. And it's hard. It's hard work. Enforcement's hard work. But I track it down and then and once you enforce a few of them, the word gets out.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy.
And so one of the questions came up, what's the difference between a short-term rental and a bed and breakfast? Okay. So, when is it a short-term rental? When is it a bed and
What's the
breakfast?
difference?
What's the difference?
Right.
If we were to limit short-term rentals to, for use as home occupations, how do we define, what a short-term rental is? If somebody goes on vacation for a month and rents out our house, that's a short-term rental. Somebody's renting out a room. I'm thinking of, New York's new standards for Airbnb.
Again, maybe it's a time limit thing. We talked about, an ag building being built by a certain date before, that kind of, maybe, it's one thing to say, I'm going to Europe for a month and I'm going to trade with somebody in Europe and we're going to switch houses for a month, and that happens once a year, as opposed to it happening week after week after week, year long. That is an obvious short-term rental as opposed to somebody just using your house for one time a year or something.
And then there's the enforcement question that goes along with it. Jennifer?
So I agree with this B&B versus short-term rental. I mean, we've certainly had people argue, not necessarily in EFU, but we've had issues with lack of clarity about short-term rentals throughout the county that we've now resolved in most places, but not in resource zones. But it's the whole, well, if I leave a box of cereal on the counter, then I'm a B&B. It's like, well, maybe you are. So I agree there's a need to define. And then the other thing I've struggled with, because LUBID certainly suggested in their decision on our short-term rental ordinance, that maybe there was a pathway in resource zones and that maybe a home occupation would work. But I wonder about the residency standard in 215 about, the home occupation having to be operated by a resident of the property. And it's that, well, when is somebody a resident, how many days of the year?
Got a Marion County case on that.
So I don't know the answer. Maybe there's a case law that does answer it. I was going to have our lawyer look at some point, but I think that would need to be clarified as well if we're thinking we're going to make short-term rentals home occupations.
You're right, Jennifer. We just did have a Marion County case on who has to occupy that. So
fabulous. I need that.
Basically, and I'd have to read the decision again, but they basically said, if the person isn't living there, then it isn't a residence. So how can it be a home occupation? And instead it was lodging,
But the other question there is that you can hire somebody who can be a resident, and I don't think that's the appropriate use.
Well, it's gotta be
of it. And that's happening where you hire somebody to live there and run the B&B, or hire somebody to live there to then run the short-term rental.
Yeah, and I think
that's why I've specified it.
And I think the court said something
Owner
there
and
too.
a resident.
Yeah, I think the court said something there too, because they had hired this person to manage the B&B. And the person was not paying rent or whatever, and the courts ultimately said that person isn't living there, so, or they were, even though they were hired to be there during the time when there was somebody there. So that was not a home occupation. But we got to look at the case law, because that was a pretty recent decision.
I guess the great shelter not. I think that just got accepted for review.
Yeah, okay, that makes, yeah.
Yeah.
One of those was our case out of the river that just got.
Yeah, I remember that one too, so.
So we have about 12 minutes left in this meeting. It went by so quickly. I think Angela for future meetings is sending out a poll to look at maybe adding a half an hour before or after the next meeting.
So
it's already out.
October 9th and November 2nd.
Okay, so we are going to extend
Those two
October
are going to
meetings. Okay. So I think it's about time to wrap up. Any final thoughts on the conversation today before I go over sort of like the next steps for this? No. All right, so Jackie.
I'm just thinking, like, as a farmer in my shoes, I feel that I'm learning a lot listening to like Jennifer and Matry, like the other side of you, the logistics and the big picture differently, like Christian was saying, taking a zoom or step back. And I'm still feeling like the overall value and respect and care for the EFU is missing. And I know that's probably just a personal thing for me, but I feel that if the intent is to preserve our finite resources, then whatever it takes to make things more clear for our environment, for our food and fiber sustainability, for the livelihood of Oregonians, I just feel such strong urgency because especially with the inconsistency among the counties and as a farmer in Washington County, it's depressing, it's sad, it's overwhelming. And I really appreciate everyone's time and being a part of this so that I could learn and try to help and contribute in a positive way.
And thank you, Jackie, and I definitely appreciate your time here. And I think that's important to remember, as we're having these conversations, exclusive farming zones are a conservation program. This is land that has been protected in order to preserve the agricultural economy. And there has been a cost associated with that over time as well. And as we're talking about what's happened with this regulatory framework, that intent that of the agricultural lands policy in 215, 243 to preserve agricultural economy, we should lose sight of that. Jim, did you
Yeah,
wanna-
to build on both what you've said and Jackie said, when I work over these types of issues in agriculture, I keep reminding myself of three components that agriculture needs, and the issues associated with them. I just want to quickly hit those again. Number one, the land base. The land base, it's a conversion issue, and conversion can mean speculative land values. And what non-farm uses do is create speculative land values that makes it harder and harder for farmers to compete. And thus that's a shadow conversion of farmland. So the land availability, it can be impacted by non-farm uses, not just by the use being cited on there, but that the shadow it casts in terms of speculative land values. The second is infrastructure needs. So water, for example, water availability, carrying capacity, transportation needs and the like. How does the non-farm use impact the infrastructure needs of agriculture? And so as we're thinking about these non-farm uses, that's another element. And then lastly, and the one that is the most obvious that we talk about all the time, but is also the ability to operate. So you need the land, the infrastructure, including the water, and the ability to operate. So this gets to the farm impacts test, the cumulative impacts of the farm impacts test. And like, those are the three components that I always have going through my head when we discuss these issues. And I just wanted to bring that up again. So.
Ian.
I just wanted to point out something that's been in the back of my mind throughout the discussion today, which is, I've been learning a lot as well, hearing from the farmers, hearing from the other planning practitioners. And I haven't had a whole lot to say just because, Clatsop County hasn't, at least in my time here over the last 5 years, we haven't dealt with too many of these issues. We get a lot of questions about what can be done on EFU land, but one of the main things that I hear from people is that, in this county in particular, and I would imagine some of the other coastal counties, it's at least perceived that it's difficult or not possible to make a living solely from farming. And so there's a lot of interest in what else people could do. And a lot of people who say, well, if I could just get this conditional use permit for some kind of a commercial activity, that would allow me to be able to farm the property and to start a farm. But I think there's again, at least a perception here, which may or may not be true, that you cannot make a living solely from farming and that you need to be able to have other activities that you can do on the land. So I just wonder throughout this discussion, again, something that's just been on my mind is what kind of nuances there can be for differences in, say, climate in a county. We have EFU zones, derived from soil types, but that is sort of agnostic to climate. And so I like the ideas of, for example, with the cidery example, to have different tiers available to people and different standards that apply at each tier. So anyway, that's just something that I wanted to share that was in the back of my mind today.
So there's a very long answer to that and some short answers. We've got about 6 minutes. So the farm use program is actually designed to be agnostic to operator capability and market conditions. It recognizes that agricultural land is a finite resource and that it should be protected. And trends in agriculture will come and will go over time. And protection of that land isn't necessarily dependent on an individual operator's ability to realize a profit off that land. There's lots of small scale agricultural operations along the coast, and as well as large scale operations. Broadway wasabi is an example of one that's somewhat agnostic to soil. That's gotten a lot of press and attention on a fairly small property. But I think, and there's ways I'm really curious to hear how other planners address that as well, but sort of in the interest of time, I'm gonna talk more about next, and we can continue to a little bit. So next steps after the conversation today, what I am going to do is to take another stab at the issues matrix for meeting 2. And I'm going to listen to the meeting recording and flesh out the action items again, and then circulate it to the working group tomorrow. So if you want to review the edits that I'm making on trying to capture this conversation and the sort of action items, and I'll limit it to these, sort of list a couple of the things that were brought up that we're going to talk more about. If you could review those edits and get your thoughts back to me, that would be great. And in preparation for our next meeting, which we're going to talk about dwellings, I am also, before the end of the week, going to circulate issues matrix that's specific to our next meeting about dwellings and dwelling issues. And so if you have thoughts, additions, tweaks to the dwellings matrix, please get those comments back to me before the 28th. So that I can circulate it again before our next meeting and get that published online with sort of additional thoughts and responses to the dwellings topics. And in this way, going back and forth with the matrix between meetings, I think we're able to cover a lot more ground than we would be able to otherwise. So I appreciate you guys taking the time sort of offline between the meetings to think about us and provide your feedback. So again, if folks are watching us and you missed this meeting, feel free to forward thoughts. If you didn't get your comments, to me on the original issues matrix, feel free to go ahead and send those additional thoughts on in as well. And with that, I'll look forward to our next meeting on October 9th. And are we adding a half hour before or after?
It's before, and it's, I believe it's 8 to 10.
Okay. Great. So we'll have 2 hours on the 9th to talk about dwelling issues. All right. So any last questions or reflections on the process? Okay, Angela will update the calendar invitations by Friday.
Yeah, the survey, if you haven't completed the doodle poll, please complete the doodle poll that I sent out. I'd like to finalize those by this Friday so I can get be prepared for the tentative meetings if needed. Thank you.
All right, thank you everybody for your time today. This is a really interesting conversation. I appreciate all of your thoughts and feedback and your participation in the process. Okay. Well, thank you all.
Thank you, Hillary.
We'll see you later.
Thank you.